In today's lecture, we will discuss monetary policy in US. I'll try to give you a historical background of monetary policies in US, what typically Fed have did, and also how monetary policies have changed since the Great Recession. So what this particular graph is showing is the links between federal funds rate, unemployment rate, and inflation rate. And it's divided into 9 different episodes since 1970s. So it's a monetary policy of the Federal Reserve over the last 4 decades. So this is your federal funds rate, which is the interest rate that monetary policy targets. This is the unemployment rate, this dotted line, and this darker line is your inflation rate. And one thing you have seen or you're seeing here is this: there is a pattern, and the pattern is this: typically Fed historically, if there is a higher inflation rate, especially during this time, you see 1970s, late 1970s, early 1970s, every time there is a high inflation, Fed increased the federal funds rate. How did they increase it? They increased it through contractionary monetary policy. So throughout the 70s, Fed followed a policy of contractionary monetary policy to raise the interest rate so that inflation is under control. On the other hand, if you look at the more recent times, whenever unemployment increased, especially this time period, and in this time period, you will see a expansionary monetary policy. So typically Fed try to counter unemployment rate by expansionary monetary policy. And how it worked? They basically increase the money supply so that federal funds rate decreases, so that aggregate demand increases through increase in consumption and investment. So overall, Fed is very consistent in terms of what they did in prior recessions and booms to control inflation and unemployment. Inflation was countered by contractionary monetary policy, and unemployment was countered by expansionary monetary policy. So next I'll try to focus on the Fed policies during the Great Recession. Obviously, during the Great Recession, they followed two broad policies. One was to bring the federal funds rate to almost zero. They followed another policy which is quantitative easing, which was not in Fed's typical handbook what they should be doing. This is a something what is called non-conventional policies. And why it is non-conventional? Because Fed for the first time decided to purchase long-term government and private mortgage-backed securities to make credit available to hopes of stimulating aggregate demand. Now Fed typically buys short-term bonds, government bonds, and they never bought private bonds. So, but for the first time through quantitative easing, what Fed did, they bought long-term government bonds and also private mortgage-backed securities. And the idea was simple: because during the recession, all these banks were holding mortgages, and mortgages were can be thought of as a bond. However, these mortgages were not paid back because people couldn't pay back for different reasons. So banks were didn't have the liquidity. That means they didn't have the cash flow. What Fed did, by buying up these mortgage-backed securities, they give money to the banks to have liquidity. Now let's see how each of these policies worked out. First, let's start with the federal funds rate. And you can see here, especially this is the time period when the recession hit, and this is your Great Recession. And you can see how the Fed funds rate decreased from more than 5% to close to zero around this time period. This is your close to zero. And it was deliberate policy that Fed took to bring down the interest rate so that investment and consumption increases, and as a result aggregate demand is was expected to increase. However, during the Great Recession, aggregate demand didn't go up that fast enough, especially through decreased interest rate. So Fed had to take a non-conventional policy. And the non-conventional policy, as I mentioned, they took the quantitative easing. So quantitative easing differs from monetary policy or traditional monetary policy in two particular ways. First, the Fed purchases long-term treasury bonds rather than short-term treasury bills. And secondly, as I mentioned earlier, instead of purchasing treasury securities, the Fed also began purchasing private mortgage-backed securities, which was very non-conventional. Now, quantitative easing is offered through three episodes. First is known as QE1, which began in November 2008, where Fed purchased 600 billions in mortgage-backed securities from government enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are mortgage insurance companies. So they were in water when the recession started. As a result, to bring in liquidity in these insurance companies, what they do, they bought 600 billions of mortgage-backed securities from these enterprises. Then we have QE2, which was offered in November 2010, in which Fed purchased 600 billions in US Treasury bonds. These are the long-term Treasury bonds that they bought. And finally, QE3, which was offered in 2012, when Fed commenced purchasing $40 billion of additional mortgage-backed securities per month. This amount was increased in December 2012 to $85 billion per month. The Fed stated that when economic conditions permit, it will tapering or reduce monthly purchases. By October 2014, the Fed announced that the final 15 billion bond purchase, which leads to the ending of quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing is not something which is called traditional monetary policy. This was adopted during the Great Recession, and this is still very controversial policy because we really don't know what will be the impact of these policies, and that we'll have to see in future. But having said that, these are some of the policies that Fed instituted in the last 4 decades in US monetary policy.